Hi, I'm Randy Willis with Talanton Church Services. And today I'm going to talk about the fascinating subject of church budgets. But before I start, I want to share a story with you that I think will kind of help frame our discussion. So next summer, my wife and I are planning to go on an excursion, a trip through the national parks. And parks like the Grand Tetons, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Mount Rushmore, the Badlands. And there's a lot of different ways that this trip can happen. You know, we could fly, we could drive, we could, heaven forbid, buy an RV like my wife wants to do, or we could hitchhike. And there's lots of ways that this trip can happen. But there are a few important principles that are actually going to make this a successful trip. You know, these are principles that if we ignore them, we can choose to ignore them, but if we do, the trip will be memorable, just not exactly in the ways that we thought it would be. So for example, some of these principles might include things like we have to pack. We have to plan our trip. Are we going to go in a circular route? Are we going to counterclockwise route? Are we going to go one place and do spokes out of a wheel and go to the different parks? Are we going to take advantage of the experience of other people like the locals and perhaps people that have been to these parks? We probably should. We should probably also be flexible because of the schedule. You never know what kind of weather we're going to run into. And so these are just some principles that'll make the trip successful. Now, I could probably tease out this analogy for another 15 minutes or so, and most pastors and church leaders that are listening can do that for me. But let's get on to the idea of how this relates to creating a church budget. Just as with our trip, there are several principles that, in my experience as an executive pastor, are core to producing a successful church budget. So I want to talk about these for just a little bit. And I think any real budget that is going to be successful is going to incorporate some, if not all, of these principles. The first is that you need to allow enough adequate time for the budget process to play out. If we try to cram the budget process into a few short weeks, it's ripe for error. In my experience, and it depends on the size of the budget, of course, but I would say 3 to 4 months is probably the right time frame for creating and getting a budget to final proposal. Number two is I think that we want to gather input from people that are closest to the action. So if we have a pastoral team that is submitting budget requests, or if we have a facilities manager, the guy that is going to be implementing what's in the budget, let's let them have input into the budget. And next, I think it's important to take advantage of others' experience. Whether it's best practices that you might find in print in a book, or recommendations for guidelines for budgets, or consultants, it's important to take advantage of their experience. So many times when it comes to church budgets, we just do the same thing we've done for years, and we don't really get the opportunity to learn from others that have gone through this same process and perhaps have different approaches that would benefit us. Next, I think it's important that we have perspective. And I say this, please hear me say this, every budget is a faith budget. Every budget relies on our people's giving. I've heard it said that our budget is the sum total of our people's worship to our God. And so we want to steward that very carefully, but we also want to have a perspective that every budget is going to require some faith. Next, it's going to take some courage to make tough calls, because likely there's going to be more things that want to be in the budget than we have bandwidth to put them in the budget. So somebody, whether it's an executive board or elders or some sort of trustees, somebody is going to have to make the call about what goes in the budget and what actually goes out of the budget. And then lastly, I would say that we have to be open to mid-course corrections. Many of these budgets, if it takes a 3 or 4 month process to get to a budget, by the time you get 4 or 5 months in, you are 9 months away from the time the budget was initially submitted. And so you want to be able to make some mid-course corrections as giving fluctuates, as priorities change. You want to be able to make some mid-course corrections. So don't be so tightly tied to a specific budget that you're not willing to make adjustments as time goes along. There's 2 or 3 things that I would suggest that will really help. These principles will really help when it comes to making a budget. One is priorities. I would suggest that any line item in a budget needs to have a priority 1, 2, or 3. Priority 1 says, without this item, this ministry does not exist. We might as well close the doors if we're not going to have this. Number 2 says, priority 2 items say, this, I don't have to have this, but boy, if I had this, it would take my ministry to the next level. And then number 3 says, if I was dreaming, if giving supported this, this is really what I would like to see us do in my area of ministry. So those are the priorities, 1, 2, or 3, and everything should have a priority 1, 2, or 3. Now, the reason this is important is if this is done at the beginning of the budget cycle, then if cuts are necessary later because giving does not support the budget that was approved, we've made the decision about priorities without the emotion of the moment. We made that at the beginning, and we are going to cut, for example, 50% of the priority 3s, and that's just the way it's going to have to be. And so making those ahead of time sure makes it a lot easier if tough times come. The second thing that I would suggest is necessary for a budget is what I would call flex dollars. And these are for unexpected opportunities that might arise. Again, this is months after the budget was originally approved. You might have an opportunity in the community or an opportunity to give to someone, and the budget may be so structured that you didn't have that space. So you may want to put a percentage of your budget, it could be 0.5% or 1% of your budget, into a line item such that you can access it with approval of the trustees, the deacons, or the executive team, that you can access it should an opportunity arise that you want to use that money for. And so I highly recommend a flex option, if you will, in the budget. And then thirdly is guidelines that I frankly have taken from a book called Money Matters in the Church, which is a play on words. Money matters, but these are money matters as well. And that divides the church budget into 4 different areas: missions, programming, facilities, and personnel, and provides guidelines on a percentage basis of what your budget ought to be. So for example, missions should range, they recommend missions and outreach should range between 10 and 15% of your budget. Programming, which is all the kids programs, the youth programs, any other kind of programs like that, divorce care and those kinds of things, should range between 22%, give or take a couple of points, percentage points. And then facilities ought to be somewhere around that same place, probably 22%, give or take, again, 2 or 3 points of percentage. And then lastly, personnel should be somewhere between 47% and 53% of your budget. Now, these aren't hard and fast rules, but if you stay within these guidelines, you know that you are following best practices that we've seen across the United States. Just know that as you create your budget, and if you have any questions, please email me at randy@talantonservices.com, because I'm praying for you. I want to support you, and I pray that your budget will be God-honoring and a good steward of the worship money that your people have given to our holy God.